Understandably, with the Russian army currently occupying large chunks of Ukraine, including most of the country's ports, and Ukrainian farmers fighting on the front lines, the harvesting and shipping season in the country will be a difficult one this year. But it won't be much easier for Russia either. With enormous international sanctions, shipping companies leaving ports, and an increasingly unpopular war that is consuming vast quantities of resources and money, Russia, who is usually by far the world's largest exporter of wheat, may struggle to ship out supplies to countries who need it as well. Together, Russia and Ukraine account for around a third of the entire world's wheat and barley exports. And as a result of the war and the sanctions hampering that third of the global supply, wheat and barley prices across the world have been skyrocketing. And countries that rely heavily on wheat coming in from the breadbasket of Europe are going to struggle to make ends meet. War-ravaged Syria has already announced that it'll have to cut spending and ration bread. And then there's Yemen, already torn apart by an ongoing and brutal civil war that has claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands and already facing a starvation situation. Yemen is the world's 12th largest importer of wheat, and nearly 40% of the country's wheat imports usually come from Russia and Ukraine. What are they going to do if 40% of their wheat supply gets wiped out this year, when they're already facing the prospects of a famine as it is? The consequences of Ukraine and Russia's wheat being blocked off from the global market will be profound and likely hugely unexpected. The last time that global wheat prices surged this high was more than a decade ago, back in 2010. And the steeply increased prices on such a vital commodity for much of the Middle East and North Africa led to public unrest that potentially partially contributed to the Arab Spring revolutions at the end of that year that saw titanic political shifts across Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, and Syria. There's really just no telling how vastly the crisis in Ukraine today could affect things like this going forward in the near future. But something that is clear now is that wars in the 21st century almost always have vast global consequences. Putin's invasion of Ukraine has changed Russia, Ukraine, and the world forever in more ways than I could ever convey in a 30-minute video on YouTube. But by analyzing how Putin and how Russia have behaved and fared before during times of war and crisis, we can likely figure out how this present conflict will ultimately go. The invasion of Ukraine is only the latest of several wars initiated by Putin's regime. And as the ferocity and intensity of Russian attacks on the country continue ramping up in scale, the scenes that we're all seeing in the news every day are beginning to reflect more and more the very first war that Putin led Russia through more than 2 decades ago in Chechnya. Today, Chechnya is a republic within Russia, and its leader, Ramzan Kadyrov, is a close ally of Putin's, who has deployed his own Chechen forces alongside of the Russians in Ukraine. But 3 decades ago, this was hardly the case. As the Soviet Union disintegrated, Chechen separatists declared their independence from Russia, and the Russian government fought a series of brutal wars to keep them under their control. The first war against Chechnya lasted for 2 years, and despite having overwhelming military superiority, the Russians largely failed to win because of poor morale amongst their troops and near universal opposition amongst the Russian public at home. 2 issues that are similarly crippling the Russian war effort in Ukraine today. After thousands of lives that were lost, the Russians signed a peace treaty and Chechnya was a de facto independent state. But then just a couple of years later, in 1999, after the rise to power in the Kremlin of an at the time unknown Vladimir Putin, the war resumed once again under his new command. Chechnya was devastated, and the capital Grozny was besieged and so thoroughly destroyed that in 2003, the United Nations called it the most destroyed city on Earth. Putin began his political career as the leader of Russia by violently subjugating Chechnya back beneath the control of the Kremlin. And as a result, it is one of the most important conflicts to know about in understanding the current war in Ukraine.